You think that relic can even reach the target? Gunnery Sergeant Williams barked, his voice cutting through the desert heat. His finger jabbed toward the weathered rifle in Robert Anderson's weathered hands. The 81-year-old groundskeeper stood motionless behind the firing line, his pale green eyes scanning the wind-swept terrain with unsettling precision. Williams was the epitome of modern warfare. Tactical gear gleaming, ballistic computer worth more than most cars strapped to his wrist. His elite Marine sniper team had been failing all morning, their cutting-edge equipment useless against the one 700-yard target that might as well have been on Mars. "This is a restricted military range, old man," Williams continued, stepping closer. "Civilian presence is strictly prohibited." Robert's gaze never wavered from the flags dancing in conflicting patterns across the range. "The wind isn't telling you the truth," he said quietly, unwrapping the cloth-bound object with deliberate care. What emerged made every Marine freeze. An M40, wood and steel from another war, scarred and battle-worn. Williams laughed incredulously as warning sirens began wailing in the distance. "Before we continue, if you believe wisdom should never be dismissed, type respect below and tell me where you're watching from. This story of Robert Anderson shows why experience matters more than equipment." I read every comment. The morning had started like any other advanced sniper training exercise at Rattlesnake Ridge Range. 6 of the Marine Corps' most elite marksmen, armed with the latest in tactical technology, faced what should have been a routine challenge. The target, a steel silhouette barely visible through the shimmering heat waves at 700 yards. But nothing about this morning was routine. Lance Corporal Martinez adjusted his state-of-the-art Kestrel wind meter for the 15th time, watching the digital display fluctuate wildly. "Gunny, I'm getting readings all over the place. Winds showing 8 miles per hour from the left, but my ballistic solver keeps throwing different firing solutions." Staff Sergeant Thompson lowered his spotting scope, frustration etched across his face. "Same here. The mirage is boiling like crazy out there. These thermals are creating wind layers I can't read." Williams felt his jaw clench. This was supposed to be a demonstration of Marine Corps precision, a showcase for the visiting brass next week. Instead, his best snipers looked like recruits trying to thread a needle in a hurricane. That's when Robert Anderson appeared. The old groundskeeper had been tending the base facilities for over a decade, invisible to most Marines. Always quiet, always working, pushing his lawnmower across the parade grounds with the same steady rhythm, day after day. Most barely noticed him, just another civilian contractor keeping the base running. But Robert noticed everything. He watched the Marines struggle, observed their growing frustration as million-dollar technology failed them. The wind wasn't cooperating with their computers, and the heat was playing tricks with their scopes. "Sir, you cannot be in this area," Williams called out, his voice sharp with authority. "This is an active live-fire range." Robert continued unwrapping the long cloth bundle, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Your equipment's reading the wind wrong," he said, his voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "You're getting 3 different currents at 3 different ranges. The computers can't see that." Williams felt heat rise in his face, not from the desert sun, but from embarrassment. Here was some maintenance worker, probably never held a rifle in his life, lecturing elite Marines about marksmanship. "Listen, Pops," Williams said, walking toward Robert with the confident stride of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I appreciate the folk wisdom, but we're dealing with Coriolis effect, spin drift, and barometric pressure that changes every 5 minutes. We have equipment for reading conditions that costs more than most people's houses." Robert's pale green eyes shifted from the distant flags to William's face. There was no challenge in that gaze, no disrespect, just the quiet confidence of a man who had seen things most people couldn't imagine. "That computer of yours," Robert said, gesturing toward Williams's wrist-mounted ballistic solver, "can't feel the thermal coming off those rocks at 200 yards. Can't sense the downdraft from that ravine on the left. The flag at your target is showing one thing, but the bullet's going to fly through 2 other wind systems before it gets there." Lance Corporal Davis, the youngest member of the team, had been listening intently. Something about the old man's words resonated. He'd been watching those heat waves all morning, noticing patterns his instruments couldn't quantify. But what happened next shocked everyone. Williams's professional pride took over completely. This wasn't just about marksmanship anymore. It was about respect, authority, and the chain of command. No civilian, especially not some old groundskeeper, was going to embarrass him in front of his Marines. "And I suppose you could do better," Williams challenged, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gestured at the cloth-wrapped object in Robert's hands, now partially revealed. "What have you got there anyway? Grandpa's hunting rifle?" The fabric fell away completely. What the Marines saw defied logic. It was an M40, the legendary rifle of Marine snipers from Vietnam. Wood stock dark with age and linseed oil, scarred in ways that spoke of hard use in impossible conditions. The scope mounted on top was simple, lacking the complex turrets and digital displays of modern optics. Staff Sergeant Thompson whispered to Martinez, "That's not possible. Those rifles are in museums." But Lance Corporal Davis saw something else. His grandfather had shown him photos from Vietnam. Stories of Marine snipers who became legends. The rifle in Robert's hands wasn't a replica. It had the wear patterns, the specific modifications that came only from combat use. "You cannot be serious," Williams said, his voice rising. "You think that antique can even reach the target, let alone hit it? The barrel on that thing is probably worn smooth." He pointed at a particularly deep gouge near the bolt. "Look at this thing. It belongs in a museum. You're going to hurt yourself, old man." The moment Williams's finger touched the worn wooden stock, something changed in Robert's eyes. For just an instant, the present seemed to fade away. The desert heat became humid jungle air. The sound of wind through the range flags became the whisper of monsoon rain through triple canopy forest. Robert was 19 again, lying in a nest of ferns, his heart steady against his ribs. Through the simple scope, he watched a small clearing half a mile away, where an enemy machine gunner was setting up. One shot would save an entire platoon of his brothers. He let half a breath out, settled the crosshairs, and squeezed the trigger. Back on the range, Robert's eyes refocused on Williams. The memory had lasted only seconds, but something in his presence had changed, become heavier, more substantial. Lance Corporal Davis felt a chill despite the desert heat. He'd been studying that old man's face, and recognition was building in the back of his mind. He'd heard stories from the old-timers at the armory, whispers about the quiet groundskeeper who used to be somebody important. Williams, however, was fully committed to his course of humiliation. "I am not going to ask you again, sir. This is a restricted area. You are a civilian, and you are creating a safety hazard. Put that weapon down and step away from the firing line." That's when Davis made a decision that would change everything. "Gunny," Davis said, standing up from his shooting position. "My rifle's having extraction issues. The bolt's sticking. Permission to take it to the repair shop at the armory?" Williams, distracted and irritated by the confrontation, waved a dismissive hand. "Whatever. Just get it fixed. We're not leaving until someone hits this target." Davis grabbed his rifle and jogged away from the firing line, but he didn't go to the repair shop. He ducked behind a line of Humvees, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number he'd memorized from the base directory. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Armory, Master Gunnery Sergeant Johnson speaking." "Master Guns. It's Lance Corporal Davis from Bravo Company. I'm out at Rattlesnake Ridge with Gunny Williams's advanced sniper team." Davis lowered his voice, glancing back toward the firing line. "Sir, you're not going to believe this, but there's an old civilian here with an M40, looks like Vietnam era. Gunny Williams is about to have him arrested for trespassing." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The old guy who tends the grounds? Quiet fellow with a slight limp? That's him, Master Guns. But sir, Williams called him Robert Anderson." The silence on the other end was sudden and absolute. It stretched for nearly 10 seconds. When Master Gunnery Sergeant Johnson spoke again, his voice was completely different, tight, urgent, stripped of all casualness. "Son, are you telling me that Robert Anderson is on that range right now with an M40? "Yes, Master Guns. Listen to me very carefully, Davis. Do not, under any circumstances, let Gunny Williams put a hand on that man. Do whatever you have to do. I'm making a call right now. Just keep them there." The line went dead. Davis stood behind the Humvee, ice forming in his stomach. He had the distinct feeling he'd just pulled the pin on a grenade. What nobody knew was that Master Gunnery Sergeant Johnson was already reaching for his secure phone, dialing a number that connected directly to the base commander's office. Colonel Marcus Hayes was reviewing personnel files when his aide knocked and entered without waiting for a response. The young captain's face was pale. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption, but there's a priority call on your direct line from Master Gunnery Sergeant Johnson. He said to tell you it's a phantom protocol." Colonel Hayes frowned. There was no such thing as a phantom protocol, but Johnson was a Marine who'd forgotten more about the Corps than most officers ever learned. He didn't engage in drama. Hayes picked up the phone. "This is Hayes." He listened for 30 seconds, his posture slowly stiffening, his knuckles turning white where he gripped the receiver. "What? At Rattlesnake Ridge with Williams's team? Who did you say is there?" There was a long pause. The colonel's eyes widened, a look of profound shock washing over his features. "Are you absolutely certain it's him, after all these years?" Hayes slammed the phone down and shot to his feet. "Captain, get my vehicle now. Tell the sergeant major to meet me at the front entrance in 2 minutes. We're going to Rattlesnake Ridge. Lights and sirens." Back at the range, Williams had reached his breaking point. The old man's placid refusal to be intimidated was more infuriating than any argument would have been. "That's it. I'm done with this circus," Williams declared, his voice rising. He took a step closer to Robert, invading his personal space. "Sir, I am giving you a direct order to vacate this military installation." Robert stood perfectly still. The M40 cradled in his arms like he'd held it 1,000 times before. The weapon seemed to belong there, not like an old man playing with a relic, but like a craftsman with his most trusted tool. "If you refuse," Williams continued, "I will place you under apprehension myself and have the MPs escort you to a holding cell. You are interfering with a live fire exercise and endangering my Marines." To emphasize his point, Williams reached out and placed a firm hand on Robert's shoulder, intending to physically guide him away from the firing line. Robert didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He simply looked at the younger Marine's hand on his shoulder, then up at his face. The look in his eyes wasn't anger or fear. It was something closer to pity, a profound, weary sadness. That was when Lance Corporal Davis, still positioned behind the Humvees, saw something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, dust clouds were rising from the main base road. Not one vehicle, multiple vehicles, moving fast. The kind of speed that tore up asphalt and didn't care about regulations. Staff Sergeant Thompson, who'd been watching the confrontation with growing unease, suddenly spoke up. "Gunny, maybe we should just—" "Stay out of this, Thompson," Williams snapped. "I've got this handled." But Martinez had also spotted the approaching vehicles. "Gunny, we've got company coming. Look like official vehicles." Williams glanced toward the road, then back at Robert. His grip on the old man's shoulder tightened. "I don't care who's coming. This civilian is leaving right now." What none of the young Marines understood was the significance of what was happening. They'd never heard the stories that circulated among the old-timers. They didn't know about the ghost who'd vanished into civilian life decades ago, the legend who'd chosen anonymity over recognition. Robert Anderson wasn't just any Vietnam veteran. He was the Marine sniper with the third longest confirmed kill in Corps history. A shot made during a monsoon in the A Shau Valley, through wind and rain that would make today's conditions look like a gentle breeze. The enemy had called him the Silent Death. His fellow Marines had called him the Ghost. And for 40 years, he'd been hiding in plain sight, tending lawns and fixing sprinklers, watching new generations of Marines struggle with challenges he'd mastered before they were born. The first siren cut through the air, a distant wail that made everyone on the range freeze. It started far off, but grew louder by the second, joined by others. All heads turned toward the road, where a convoy of black military vehicles was approaching at dangerous speed, their emergency lights flashing silently in the bright desert sun. Lance Corporal Davis felt his heart hammering. Whatever he'd set in motion with that phone call was about to arrive, and he had the sinking feeling that Gunnery Sergeant Williams had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The convoy was less than a minute away, and Williams still had his hand on the shoulder of a man whose identity would soon shock everyone present. But what nobody could have predicted was exactly who was about to step out of those vehicles, and what they were about to learn about the quiet groundskeeper who'd been invisible to them for so many years. The convoy screeched to a halt just yards from the firing line, doors flying open before the vehicles had fully stopped. The first man out was Colonel Hayes himself, his uniform immaculate, his face a mask of cold fury. Behind him came the base sergeant major, a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite. The entire range went dead silent. The snipers who'd been watching the confrontation snapped to attention. Williams froze, his hand still on Robert's shoulder, a look of utter confusion spreading across his face. In 15 years as a Marine, Williams had never seen the base commander arrive anywhere with such urgency, let alone a training range. Colonel Hayes ignored Williams completely. His eyes were locked on Robert Anderson, and he strode forward with purpose, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped directly in front of the old man, looked at Williams' hand on Robert's shoulder, and his eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. Williams snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. Then the unthinkable happened. Colonel Hayes snapped to the sharpest, most precise salute any of the Marines had ever witnessed. His back ramrod straight, his arm locked, his gaze filled with pure respect. "Chief Warrant Officer Anderson!" The colonel's voice boomed across the silent range. "Sir, I apologize for the conduct of my Marines. There is no excuse for the disrespect you have been shown here today." The collective gasp from the young snipers was audible. Williams looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his jaw slack, his face ashen. In 30 seconds, he'd gone from complete authority to being the target of his commanding officer's wrath. The sergeant major walked over to Williams and spoke in a whisper that somehow carried the weight of an earthquake. "Gunnery Sergeant, what in God's name did you think you were doing?" Colonel Hayes held his salute until Robert gave a slow, almost tired nod. Only then did the colonel drop his hand and turn to address the stunned Marines. "For your education," Hayes began, his voice leaving no room for misunderstanding, "allow me to properly introduce the man you have been disrespecting." He gestured toward Robert. "This is Chief Warrant Officer Robert Anderson, retired. He quite literally wrote the Marine Corps doctrine on extreme range precision shooting that you've all been failing to apply." The colonel's eyes swept over their faces, each one now a mask of awe and shock. During 3 tours in Vietnam, the enemy had many names for American snipers, but there was one Marine they feared above all others. They called him the Silent Death, the ghost who could reach out and touch them from distances they thought impossible. Robert stood quietly, the M40 still cradled in his arms. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture had shifted, the unconscious straightening of a man who'd once carried the weight of impossible missions. "Mr. Anderson holds the 3rd longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history," Hayes continued. "A shot he made during Typhoon Carmen in 1967, through winds that would ground aircraft today in a monsoon that turned day into night." Martinez whispered to Thompson, "That's not possible. That shot was over a mile in those conditions." "And he made that shot," Colonel Hayes said, pausing for maximum impact, "with the very rifle your gunnery sergeant just called a museum piece." The truth hit the Marines like a physical blow. This wasn't just any old rifle. It was the rifle. The weapon that had become legend, carried by a man who'd vanished into obscurity after the war. Davis felt pieces clicking together in his mind. The old groundskeeper who'd been invisible for a decade. The way he moved, with unconscious precision. The fact that he'd read the wind patterns better than their computers. Robert Anderson hadn't been hiding from recognition. He'd been hiding from memory. In Vietnam, he'd been part of an elite unit that didn't officially exist. They called themselves the phantoms. Snipers who took the impossible shots, who eliminated targets that conventional forces couldn't reach. The mission that earned him that legendary kill had cost him everything else that mattered. His spotter that day had been his best friend since boot camp, a kid from Ohio named Tommy Martinez, Lance Corporal Martinez's uncle, though the young Marine would never know it. Tommy had been calling the wind, giving Robert the adjustments for that record-breaking shot. When a mortar round landed in their hide, Robert made the shot and saved a company of Marines 2 ridges over. But Tommy Martinez died in his arms 3 minutes later. After that, Robert Anderson had requested transfer to non-combat duties. When the war ended, he disappeared entirely, choosing a quiet life over the medals and recognition that should have been his. For 40 years, he'd carried the weight of that last shot, not as a triumph, but as a reminder of what victory sometimes cost. Colonel Hayes turned back to Robert, his voice softer now. "Chief Anderson, sir, would you do us the honor of showing these Marines how it's done?" What nobody expected was what happened next. Robert Anderson nodded slowly and walked to the empty firing position, not with the brisk efficiency of the younger Marines, but with the deliberate economy of motion that comes from muscle memory forged in life-or-death situations. He settled behind the M40, resting the rifle's forestock on his weathered rucksack, the same pack he'd carried in 3 tours of Vietnam, now faded and patched, but still functional. "Your computers are looking for data," Robert said, his voice calm and instructive as he spoke to the silent Marines. "You need to look for signs." He gestured toward the distant target with his free hand. "See that shimmer over the rocks at 200 yards? It's flowing right to left. That's a thermal updraft, but watch the grass on that berm at 500. It's barely moving, leaning toward you. The wind's rolling back on itself there." Martinez lowered his spotting scope, studying the heat patterns Robert was describing. For the first time all morning, the chaos of conflicting wind readings began to make sense. "The flag at your target is catching the main current all the way in the back," Robert continued. "It's showing you one story, but your bullet has to fly through 3 different wind systems to get there. You can't solve one problem. You have to thread the needle through all of them." Williams stood frozen, watching his entire worldview crumble. Everything he'd been taught about modern marksmanship, the reliance on technology, the mathematical precision of ballistic computers, was being quietly dismantled by an old man with a rifle from another war. Robert made a few subtle clicks on his scope's elevation and windage knobs. The adjustments were confident, based not on digital calculations, but on a lifetime of reading conditions that computers couldn't quantify. He settled his cheek against the worn walnut stock, a position he'd held thousands of times in places where missing meant death. "Tommy," Robert whispered so quietly that only Davis, positioned closest to him, could hear. "This one's for you, brother." Davis felt his spine tingle. There was something profoundly sacred about this moment, not just a demonstration of marksmanship, but a communion with ghosts from a war most of these Marines had only read about. Robert took a deep breath, let half of it out, and the range fell utterly silent. The crack of the M40 was sharp and nostalgic, a sound from a different era. When wars were fought with wood and steel, instead of composite materials and computer chips. Every spotting scope on the line swung toward the distant target. For a long, breathless 2.5 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of wind across the desert. Then, faint but unmistakable, a sound returned across the mile of shimmering air. The perfect, metallic ring of a copper-jacketed bullet striking hardened steel. Dead center. A wave of spontaneous applause and cheers erupted from the young Marines, a release of morning tension and a show of pure respect. These elite snipers, men who'd been struggling all morning with the most advanced equipment available, had just watched a legend make an impossible shot look routine. Colonel Hayes shook his head with an admiring smile, then turned that expression cold again as he faced Williams. "Gunnery Sergeant," Hayes said, his voice dangerously low. "Your arrogance has blinded you to your most important duty. You're not just supposed to be a good sniper. You're supposed to make more of them." Williams stood rigid, his face a mixture of shame and dawning understanding. "You had a living piece of Marine Corps history standing right here," Hayes continued. "A resource beyond price, offering wisdom for free, and you treated him like a trespasser. You have failed these Marines, and you have failed the Corps." "Sir, no excuse, sir," Williams replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "There is no excuse," Hayes confirmed. "You and your entire team will report for 1 week of remedial training in wind estimation and fieldcraft. Your instructor will be Chief Anderson, if he's gracious enough to accept the assignment." Robert pushed himself up from the firing position, his old joints protesting quietly. He walked over to Williams, who couldn't meet his eyes. Gently, Robert placed a weathered hand on the younger Marine's shoulder, the same shoulder Williams had grabbed in anger moments before. "The gear helps," Robert said quietly, his voice devoid of any triumph or resentment. "But it doesn't replace what's in here." He tapped his temple with a calloused finger. "The wind doesn't care about your computer, Gunny. It just is. You have to learn to listen to it, not just measure it." As Robert held the old M40, another memory surfaced, brief and bittersweet. He was 20 years old, standing in a Marine armory in Da Nang. A grizzled master sergeant, a veteran of the frozen Chosin, was pressing this very rifle into his hands. "She's not fancy, son," the old-timer had said, his voice gravelly from too many years and too many cigarettes. "She's heavy, and she'll kick you if you don't hold her right, but she'll never lie to you. When everything else is chaos, she'll tell you the truth." The rifle wasn't just a weapon. It was a legacy, passed from one generation of warriors to the next. What followed would transform how the Marine Corps taught precision marksmanship forever. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at Rattlesnake Ridge was completely transformed. Every morning, an elite team of Marine snipers, including a deeply humbled Gunnery Sergeant Williams, sat cross-legged on the desert floor, in a semicircle. They weren't behind their high-tech rifles. They were listening. At the center of the circle sat Robert Anderson, holding something as simple as a blade of grass, explaining how its flutter could tell you more about wind conditions than a $10,000 weather station. "Technology will give you numbers," Robert would say, holding up the grass to catch the morning breeze. "But the wind isn't mathematics. It's alive. It breathes. It changes mood. It lies to you when you're not paying attention. He taught them to read mirage not as an obstacle, but as a roadmap of invisible air currents. He showed them how to use their peripheral vision to catch movement their focused sight would miss. Most importantly, he taught them patience, something that had been programmed out of them by an over-reliance on instant digital solutions. Williams, who had initially been the most resistant, became Robert's most dedicated student. The humiliation of that first day had cracked something open inside him, his ego, and revealed the genuine desire to improve that had made him a Marine in the first place. "I spent so many years trying to eliminate every variable," Williams confided to Robert during one of their training sessions. "I thought if I could just get enough data, make everything predictable, I'd never miss." Robert nodded, adjusting the worn sling on his M40. "Fear of failure makes you rigid," he said. "But the wind is never the same twice. You have to learn to dance with uncertainty, not fight it." The transformation in the Marines' performance was remarkable. Within 2 weeks, they were making shots that had seemed impossible before Robert's arrival. More importantly, they were making those shots consistently, with confidence born from understanding rather than dependence on technology. The Marine Corps took notice. Colonel Hayes submitted a formal recommendation that Robert's wind-reading techniques be integrated into the advanced sniper curriculum. The recommendation made its way up the chain of command, eventually landing on the desk of the commandant himself. 3 months later, the Marine Corps officially adopted what they called the Anderson Wind Doctrine, a synthesis of traditional fieldcraft and modern technology that emphasized intuitive understanding over pure data reliance. Robert was invited to speak at the Marine Corps birthday ball, the first time he'd worn his dress blues in 40 years. The uniform still fit, though the man who filled it carried the weight of decades in his posture. During his speech, he spoke not of his legendary shot, but of Tommy Martinez, the spotter who died calling the wind for his brothers in arms. "Every shot we make," Robert told the assembled Marines, "we make it standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. The rifle doesn't make you a sniper. Your training doesn't make you a sniper. The willingness to carry forward the wisdom of your brothers, that's what makes you a sniper." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Back at Rattlesnake Ridge, the changes continued to ripple outward. Young Marines from other units began requesting assignment to Williams's team, word spreading that something special was happening at the desert range. Robert's teaching methods became legendary in their own right. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration when a Marine struggled to grasp a concept. He had the patience of a man who understood that mastery came through repetition and reflection, not force. Lance Corporal Davis, who had made that crucial phone call, was promoted to corporal and became Robert's unofficial assistant instructor. The 2 men formed an unlikely partnership. The young Marine's enthusiasm for learning perfectly complementing Robert's quiet wisdom. "I keep thinking about that morning," Davis said to Robert one afternoon as they watched a new group of Marines practice their wind calls. "When Gunny Williams was giving you such a hard time, you never got angry. How did you stay so calm?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. his pale green eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "When you've seen what war really costs," he said finally, "getting yelled at by a frustrated instructor doesn't seem worth getting upset about." He turned to Davis with something that might have been a smile. "Besides, anger clouds your vision, and a sniper can't afford clouded vision." The program's success attracted attention from other military branches. Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and Air Force pararescue teams began sending their snipers to train under Robert's guidance. What had started as a chance encounter on a desert firing range had become a revolution in American military marksmanship training. But for Robert Anderson, the greatest satisfaction came from something much simpler. 6 months after that transformational morning at Rattlesnake Ridge, Robert Anderson was back to his quiet routine, tending the base grounds, maintaining the facilities, moving through his days with the same steady rhythm that had made him invisible for so long. But everything had changed. Marines would nod respectfully when they passed him. Officers would stop to shake his hand. Young snipers would approach him with questions, and he would always take the time to answer, whether he was pruning bushes or fixing a broken sprinkler head. The legend had returned to his chosen life, but he was no longer anonymous. One afternoon, Williams found himself in the base hardware store on a Saturday, looking for parts to repair his backyard fence. He spotted a familiar figure in the next aisle, studying packets of vegetable seeds with the same intensity he brought to everything else. Williams took a deep breath and walked over. "Chief Anderson," he said quietly. Robert looked up, that gentle, grandfatherly smile spreading across his weathered face. "Gunny, how are you doing?" "Good, sir, real good." Williams hesitated, then pushed forward. "I wanted to thank you again for everything you taught us. My team's performance ratings have gone through the roof." Robert nodded, holding up a packet of tomato seeds. "Patience and observation," he said, with a slight wink. "Works for shooting, works for gardening, works for most things in life." Williams felt that familiar flush of humility, no longer painful, but cleansing. "Sir, I have to ask, why didn't you ever tell anyone who you were? All those years, you could have had recognition, respect, a place of honor." Robert was quiet for a moment, turning the seed packet over in his hands. "You know what I learned in Vietnam, Gunny? The most important victories are the quiet ones. The shots that save lives without anyone ever knowing they were fired. The wisdom passed on without speeches or ceremonies." He looked up at Williams. "I spent 40 years learning to live with what I'd done in war, teaching your Marines to be better at their craft. That's not something I did for recognition. That's something I did for them." Williams nodded, understanding flooding through him. "For Tommy Martinez, too." "Especially for Tommy," Robert confirmed, his voice soft but firm. "Every Marine I help become a better shot is a promise kept to my spotter. He died calling the wind so others could live. The least I can do is make sure his sacrifice keeps saving lives." The conversation was interrupted by a young Marine approaching, one of the new students in the expanded Wind Doctrine program. "Excuse me, Chief Anderson," the Marine said respectfully. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted you to know I just qualified expert on the 1,000-yard range. Used everything you taught us about reading thermals." Robert's smile was genuine and warm. "Outstanding, Marine. Your instructors must be proud." After the young Marine left, Williams shook his head in amazement. "They're calling it the Anderson effect now, sir. Marine marksmanship scores are up across the board. Other branches are adopting your techniques. You've changed how America trains its snipers." "Good," Robert said simply. "That means fewer Marines will have to learn the hard way what wind can do to a bullet." As Williams walked to the checkout counter, he reflected on the transformation in his own approach to leadership. Robert had taught him that true authority came not from rank or volume, but from competence demonstrated with quiet confidence. The old sniper had revolutionized more than just marksmanship training. He'd shown an entire generation of Marines what leadership looked like when ego was removed from the equation. 6 months later, Williams received orders to the Marine Corps' new Advanced Marksmanship Training Center in Quantico, where he would help implement the Anderson Wind Doctrine service-wide. On his last day at the desert base, he found Robert working in the small garden behind the base chapel, tending tomato plants that were growing in perfect, precisely spaced rows. "Chief," Williams said, approaching with genuine respect, "I wanted to say goodbye and to thank you one more time." Robert stood up slowly, brushing soil from his hands. "You did good work, Gunny. Your Marines are ready for whatever comes next." They shook hands. The transformed instructor and the quiet legend who had taught him that wisdom whispered often carries more weight than authority shouted. "Just remember, Gunny," Robert said, his pale green eyes holding the weight of decades. "Every Marine you train carries forward not just technique, but responsibility. They're not just learning to hit targets. They're learning to protect their brothers." Williams nodded, understanding completely now. The lesson had never been about shooting. It had been about service. Years later, when Williams had become one of the Marine Corps' most respected marksmanship instructors, he would tell new students the same thing Robert had told him that first day. "The wind doesn't care about your computer. It just is. You have to learn to listen to it." And in a small garden behind a desert-based chapel, an 81-year-old groundskeeper continued tending his tomatoes with the same precision he'd once brought to impossible shots, content in knowing that his greatest victories would always be the quiet ones. The legacy of Chief Warrant Officer Robert Anderson lived on not in monuments or medals, but in every accurate shot fired by Marines who'd learned to read the wind's whispers instead of just its data. Tommy Martinez's sacrifice continued saving lives, one perfectly placed bullet at a time. The M40 rifle that had made history rested peacefully in Robert's modest apartment. Its work done, but its lessons eternal. Sometimes the greatest weapons are the ones that teach others to fight, not the ones that fight themselves. In the end, Robert Anderson had accomplished something more valuable than any record shot. He had transformed failure into wisdom, pride into humility, and technology into understanding. The ghost of the A Shau Valley had found his final mission. Not eliminating enemies, but creating allies. Not taking lives, but saving them through knowledge passed down like a sacred trust. And every morning, as the desert sun rose over Rattlesnake Ridge, young Marines continued learning that the most advanced computer in the world couldn't replace what lived in the heart of a warrior who'd learned to listen to the wind. CTA Final. To everyone who believes respect should be earned through wisdom, not demanded through rank. Thank you for standing with our quiet heroes. Stories like Robert Anderson's remind us that true strength often wears work clothes and speaks softly. Subscribe for more stories of America's unsung legends. And share this with someone who needs to remember that experience will always matter more than equipment. See you in the next one.